Once a soul of wisdom, Ethan ascended to the heavenly realm, only to be cast back into the human world as his merits faded. At first, he lived righteously, but the temptations of power and desire slowly consumed him. He became ruthless, drowning in greed and sin. When karma struck, his empire crumbled, and his soul was dragged into the abyss of hell. Now, trapped in eternal suffering, can he ever find redemption, or is he doomed to the endless cycle of torment? Ethan opened his eyes in a new body, feeling the warmth of human breath and the steady beating of a mortal heart. The memories of the celestial realm remained, but they were no longer as vivid. The lessons from his past lives still echoed in his mind, yet they seemed like distant fragments, gradually fading beneath the harsh reality of the human world. In the early years, Ethan led a simple yet meaningful life. He treated others with kindness, helped the weak, and maintained a peaceful heart. He believed that as long as he upheld righteousness and lived a virtuous life, the cycle of reincarnation would no longer crush him. But the mortal world was not the celestial realm. And Ethan was no longer a celestial being bathed in divine light. He was now a man, living in a world filled with challenges that no lesson from the heavens had ever prepared him for. The world never stops moving. Life's currents pulled Ethan into events beyond his control. The people he helped were not always grateful. His kindness was taken advantage of. Opportunists sought to manipulate him, turning his compassion into a weakness. At first, Ethan tried to stay strong. He reminded himself that these trials were simply part of his journey. But little by little, his resolve wavered. Doubt crept in. Did kindness truly matter? Was the world truly ruled only by those who seized what they desired? Then came his first real wound, betrayal by someone he had trusted. A person he had sheltered and protected turned against him, leaving him stranded in a moment of despair. It wasn't just betrayal, it was a crushing blow to his belief in human goodness. After that, Ethan was no longer the same. He stopped offering help unconditionally. He became more pragmatic, more calculating. He still did good deeds but not out of pure compassion, rather for personal gain. These changes were subtle at first. Ethan told himself he was only protecting himself, that he was simply adapting. But each time he abandoned a part of his ideals, he stepped closer to becoming the kind of man he had once sworn he would never be. Then came a moment of decision, one that would define his path forward. An opportunity arose, but it required him to betray his own principles. To do something he had once believed was unforgivable. At first, Ethan hesitated. But then, memories of betrayal, of pain, of suffering hardened his heart. He silenced his conscience. And in that moment he truly began to lose himself. From that point on, everything changed rapidly. Ethan learned to manipulate people, to bend situations to his advantage. He was no longer the young man who sought enlightenment. He had become someone practical, someone willing to do whatever it took to achieve his desires. He felt stronger. No longer wounded by betrayal because now he was the one in control. But he failed to realize that little by little, the darkness was consuming his soul. For the first time, Ethan stopped thinking about karma. He no longer cared about reincarnation or enlightenment. All he wanted was power. And he would do anything to get it. And so, the last flicker of light within him began to fade. Time passed, and Ethan was no longer the young man with clear eyes and a pure heart. Life's hardships had taught him a bitter truth. Kindness was not always rewarded with kindness. Sometimes, it only made a person weak, an easy target for those willing to trample over others to rise. One day during an important deal, Ethan was deceived. He lost everything he had built, not because he was incompetent but because he believed in fairness. Sitting alone in a cold, empty room, staring at the documents that marked his failure, Ethan felt something new for the first time. A thought flickered in his mind. If the world had no place for the kind, then he would no longer be kind. Ethan decided to change. This time he would not let anyone step over him. At first, Ethan's changes were subtle. He stopped helping others without conditions. In business, he calculated every move, ensuring no one could take advantage of his goodwill. But soon that was not enough. He realized that to survive he needed more. He needed power. And power did not come from righteousness. Ethan learned the art of manipulation. He understood that people acted out of self-interest, and by exploiting their weaknesses, he could make them do his bidding. He began forging connections with ulterior motives. Every conversation became a silent battle, where the most cunning player emerged victorious. It wasn't long before Ethan became a feared name. He was wealthier, more influential. But the respect he received was not admiration, it was fear. The first time Ethan acted ruthlessly, he hesitated. His target was a man who had once betrayed him, someone who had laughed at his past naivety. When Ethan had the chance to strike back, he stood at a crossroads: forgive or destroy. He did not choose forgiveness. Victory tasted sweet. Watching his enemy fall, Ethan realized something. Power brought satisfaction far greater than kindness ever could. From that moment on, everything became easier. The second time, the third time, and soon mercilessness became second nature. Ethan no longer hesitated to remove those who stood in his way. Consequences no longer concerned him. Desire consumed him. He didn't just want power, he wanted everything. He wanted to stand at the pinnacle, to shape the world according to his will. In rare moments, Ethan still dreamed of his past. Days when he lived in peace, faces that once smiled at him without expectation. But when he woke, he found himself in a grand, opulent room, vast, luxurious, yet devoid of warmth. He had everything. But he no longer felt happiness. Sometimes Ethan stood before a mirror and stared into his own eyes. The light that once existed there had long since faded. Only darkness remained, deep, endless, like an abyss. But he would not allow himself to stop. He had gone too far to turn back. Ethan was no longer the man he once knew. He had crossed boundaries he never thought he would. Ambition had led him astray, but absolute power had eroded his soul to its very core. Now, when Ethan walked down the streets, people lowered their heads to avoid his gaze. At extravagant parties, everyone raised their glasses to toast him, but when the lights dimmed, whispers of fear echoed in the darkness. No one dared to stand against Ethan, but no one truly loved him either. Ethan didn't care. Power had become the only god he worshipped. ######. The first time he took a life. Power and crime always walked hand in hand. At first, Ethan only manipulated from the shadows, pushing his enemies toward ruin without staining his hands. But then one day he was faced with a more brutal choice. It was a rainy night, in a grand room filled with the scent of fear. In front of Ethan knelt a man, his former associate, the one who had betrayed him. The man trembled, his eyes filled with desperation. "Please, spare me. I was just a pawn. Please." Ethan didn't respond. His gaze was as cold as the night outside. A thought flashed in his mind. If I let him live, he'll return to strike me down. If I kill him, everything will be resolved. His fingers tightened around the gun. No hesitation. No remorse. The gunshot echoed through the silent room. Blood splattered onto his face, onto the hands that had once saved so many. And strangely he felt nothing. ######, the monster wearing a human face. After the first kill, the next ones became easier. Ethan learned that kindness was a shackle for the weak. The strong had to be ruthless, had to trample over others, had to destroy. He controlled an empire built on lies, blood, and fear. He could no longer remember the last time he felt anything remotely close to humanity. In the underworld, people whispered terrifying names about him: the Faceless Shadow, the Crimson Hand, the Black Curse. Ethan didn't care. Those names only proved that he had succeeded. But no matter how powerful he was, he couldn't escape one thing: the call of karma. One night, Ethan jolted awake, his body drenched in cold sweat. In his dream, he saw the people he had killed, their restless souls, their blood-stained hands, their hollow eyes. They didn't speak. They only stared at him. Ethan staggered to the bathroom, splashing cold water on his face. But when he looked up, he recoiled in horror. The mirror didn't reflect his face. Instead, he saw a shadow, faceless, void, an abyss of nothingness. A primal fear surged through him. Was this a trick of the mind? Or was it real? A faint laughter echoed from within his own skull. And he knew he was becoming a monster. Paranoia. Insomnia. Ethan started seeing hallucinations. At first he could ignore them. But soon they appeared even when he was awake. The whispers in the dark, the fleeting figures in the mirror, the eerie laughter resonating in the silence. He stopped sleeping. He drowned himself in alcohol, in drugs, in endless indulgence to escape. But the more he ran, the closer the ghosts came. Until one day, as he sat in his grand chamber, a voice whispered right beside his ear. Did you think you could escape? Ethan whipped around. No one was there. But he could feel it. The darkness. The darkness was waiting for him. Sin could not be erased. It only waited for the day it would come to collect its debt. Ethan didn't know when karma would strike. But he could feel it drawing near. And this time there was nowhere left to run. The power Ethan once held seemed invincible. But nothing lasts forever. Like a tower built on a rotten foundation, his downfall didn't happen in a single dramatic moment. It was slow, agonizing, One brick falling after another, one crack spreading wider each day. It all started with a small mistake. A subordinate was eliminated too conspicuously. An enemy thought to be destroyed suddenly resurfaced. A longtime ally began acting strangely. Ethan sensed something was off, but he ignored it. He was too used to being in control. Deep down, he believed that no matter what happened, he could turn things around. But this time, fate was no longer on his side. In the shadows, those who once bowed before him were whispering in secret. Those who once called him boss, master, leader, were now scheming to overthrow him. Ethan wasn't surprised. He knew well the ruthless law of this world. When a wolf grows weak, the pack will tear it apart. But he never expected the betrayal to come from those he trusted the most. One night, while drowning himself in liquor, a trusted lieutenant quietly entered his room. He carried no weapon, no visible hostility, only a blank, empty gaze. "They've made their decision, Ethan." Ethan set his glass down, raising an eyebrow. "They? The ones you once called allies, friends, brothers? They no longer stand with you." Silence filled the room. Ethan didn't ask why. He already knew. This was his karma. How many times had Ethan done this to others? Being imprisoned in his own home. Having his hands tied by those who once swore loyalty. Being dragged before those who were once mere pawns in his game. An empire collapses in silence. Ethan knelt in the dimly lit chamber, shadows casting long and eerie silhouettes across the room. Faces of former allies surrounded him. Some smirked. Some looked at him with disdain. Some reveled in their moment of vengeance. "It's time, Ethan." Someone stepped forward, placing a gun on the table. "We can settle this the old way. One bullet. No pain. You can keep what little honor you have left." Ethan looked at the gun, then at them. He chuckled. A long, echoing laugh filled the room. The betrayers frowned. "You think I fear death?" Ethan smirked. "If you could kill me that easily, I would never have been Ethan." Even when cornered, even knowing there was no escape, Ethan refused to bow. "Do it. But don't think this will end here. Karma doesn't stop. Your nightmares are just beginning." For a brief moment, his betrayers hesitated. Then the gun fired. Darkness consumed everything. Ethan could no longer feel his body. No breath. No heartbeat. Yet he still existed. His soul drifted in an endless void. No light. No gateway to another life. Only the cold embrace of darkness and distant whispers echoing through the abyss. Then a chilling wind swept past. A voice emerged, not from ahead, not from behind, but from within his very being. "Are you ready?" A powerful force pulled at him. And he knew. Hell was waiting. Ethan heard nothing but the howling wind, like thousands of razor-sharp blades slicing through his very essence. There was no light, no escape. His body, or rather his soul, was plummeting into an endless abyss. He had no idea how long he had been falling. A moment? An hour? 1,000 years? In this infinite darkness, time had lost all meaning. But his sins, his crimes, they had never been clearer. Twisted faces emerged from the void, their expressions filled with hatred and sorrow. The ones he had betrayed. The ones crushed under his ambition. The lives he had ruined, the innocent he had cast aside for power. They said nothing. They didn't need to. Ethan could feel their pain, every last bit of it. His chest tightened as if an invisible fire was consuming him from within. Yet no amount of pain, no depth of regret could change the truth. He had arrived at a place where there was no turning back. Through the endless descent, a crimson glow flickered below. But it was not the light of salvation. It was the fire of hell. A massive gate stood open, an inferno raging beyond it, hungry for lost souls. The screams that echoed were not distant cries, they came from within him. And then he fell. Ethan knelt on scorched ground, his soul trembling under the heat that radiated from below. All around him, shadowy figures in chains were dragged forward by towering entities, beings of unimaginable power with burning eyes, neither merciful nor cruel. Before him, a colossal figure sat upon a throne. It was not the horned demon of human myth, not a beast with wings of fire. It was something greater, something that existed beyond comprehension. Its eyes were twin voids that swallowed light, and when it spoke, its voice was not one but thousands, layered echoes that carried the weight of eternity. "Sinner Ethan, do you know why you are here?" Ethan clenched his fists. Even in the depths of hell, even in the face of an unstoppable force, he refused to bow. "Because I made mistakes," he murmured. "No." The voice deepened, the weight of its words pressing down on his very soul. "You are here because you chose this path. Every action, every decision has led you to this moment. The being raised a hand. And suddenly Ethan's past unfurled before him. Not the victories. Not the moments of glory. Not the dreams. Only the pain he had inflicted. Tears shed in the dark. Hands raised in desperate pleas. The echoes of suffering that had once been drowned out by the noise of power and ambition. Ethan could not look away. The images were burned into him not as memories, but as scars on his very soul. And then as they faded, the true punishment began. There were no flames to burn him. No blades to carve into his flesh. Only emptiness. Ethan felt as though his soul was unraveling, being torn apart piece by piece. His memories faded one by one. Everything he had known, everything he had cherished, every dream, every hatred, stripped away. He no longer remembered who he was. He no longer remembered why he was here. Only the pain remained, stretching on into eternity, a sentence without end. Then a voice, one he no longer recognized, spoke. You will remain here until you understand. Until you truly see yourself. Ethan did not know who had spoken. He did not understand what it meant. But as his soul continued to dissolve, as the darkness swallowed him whole, one thought remained in the last fragment of his fading consciousness. This was not the end. This was only the beginning of his punishment. There was no time. No space. No beginning or end. How long had Ethan existed in hell? He didn't know. It could have been hundreds of years, thousands, or perhaps an eternity. Everything he once had, his name, his memories, his emotions, had long been eroded by the unseen torment of this realm. He was no longer a man. He was no longer a soul. Only pain remained. Not physical wounds, not flames burning his flesh. It was a pain that carved itself deep into the very core of his being, into every shattered fragment of his existence. He was forced to witness endless visions. The crimes he had committed, the people he had destroyed, the suffering souls he had abandoned in pursuit of power and desire. He screamed in silence. But no one listened. There was no one left. At some point in the midst of his endless suffering, something shifted within him. For the first time in countless lifetimes he saw himself. Not the man who had been Ethan, the strong, the arrogant, the fearless. He saw a wretched soul, twisted by ambition, stained by karmic burdens, covered in the scars he had carved upon himself. He had once blamed the heavens, blamed others, blamed fate. But at last he understood. Everything had been his choice. No one had forced him to fall. No one had made him betray himself. He had cast aside the light with his own hands. And now all that remained was darkness. For the first time in absolute solitude, Ethan bowed his head. Not out of fear. Not out of regret. But out of acceptance. He accepted the truth of who he was. No more running. No more lies. And in that very moment something strange happened. A tiny crack formed in the darkness that had swallowed him whole. At first it was nothing more than a flickering spark, fragile as a candle in a storm. But then it grew. The light did not come from outside. It was not salvation granted by some divine force. It came from within him. From a place buried deep in his soul. Ethan no longer begged for forgiveness. He no longer wished to be reborn, nor did he seek to escape hell. He simply accepted everything. Accepted himself with all his mistakes, with all his sins, with all the wounds he had inflicted upon himself. And that acceptance shattered his chains. The light spread, tearing through the darkness that had imprisoned him for millennia. When Ethan opened his eyes, he was no longer in hell. He stood in the middle of a vast void, a formless space without shape or color. But this time he was not afraid. A voice echoed. Not grand, not terrifying, not filled with authority like before. It was calm, gentle. Do you understand now? Ethan closed his eyes and took a deep breath. I do. He was no longer the man he once was. No longer the ruler, the fallen, the damned. He had changed. The voice spoke again, but this time, it did not ask a question. Go now. Your journey is not yet over. A soft wind stirred. Light engulfed everything. Ethan fell. But this time he was not afraid. He was returning. He would live again. But this time he would not forget.